Today we've got the first in what I hope is going to be a series on the psychology of the Cardsharp. We're going to look at the mindset of a premeditated card cheat, specifically how they categorise their opposition, how they view their opposition. There's so much about cheating in the poker news at the moment, and the first line of defence is really how to recognise the kind of person that's capable of this before you were sat down with them at a table. It's all well and good to learn about moves and plays that can be done at the table, but it's better to have an early warning. It's better to be taught how to recognise that the wolf is stalking you so you can start running, rather than to be taught how he eats you when you've already been caught. So let's get into it. Whenever there's a table of players sitting down playing poker, they all fall broadly into certain categories. The longer you've been a card player, the quicker you'll generally categorise the opposition that you're playing with. All good players do this, even if they only do it subconsciously. Today we'll talk about those broad categories of players and how a working card sharp views those players. How the sharp views and approaches those categories of players is quite similar to how any winning player would, but there are some quite important differences. Before we start jumping into specific categories of players at the table, let's actually define the different kinds of cheats that you might come across at the table. Let's get started with what I like to call rough cheats. So these are the kind of players that make me reluctant to use the word cheat as a catch-all, because there's lots of different types of cheat, and there's definitely levels to being a cheat, and this is the lower end of the scale. A rough cheat is usually an average player at best who curses their luck and will try and angle shoot at every opportunity. They're not generally too dangerous, really, because they always get busted at some point, because they'll do something stupid or obvious, like try and steal from another player's stack, or look at their hole cards, look at another player's hole cards in a really obvious way. Even if they've got a good play, greed will take over and they'll overstretch it and they'll blow the play by doing that. For example, say a rough cheat managed to get a good play on. Like, let's say they managed to get a deck with work on it in a game. So by a work deck, I mean a mark deck, so they can read the cards that are face down. Instead of using that information in a subtle way, with consideration about how their play looks to everyone else at the table, they'll do stupid things like call down a massive bluff with a hand that they couldn't possibly be calling it down with normally, making plays that they're either psychic or they're cheating, basically. A card sharp, a more calculating cheat, wouldn't do silly things like that and give the play away in such a silly way. Let's talk about the card sharp. The other end of the scale, on the cheating spectrum, from the rough cheats, are the sharps, the card sharps. They are the premeditated cheats, the edge takers, the really dangerous people that you don't want to sit down with. Rather than where a rough cheat will take opportunities and sort of almost ad-lib their cheating, the sharp will have a plan. They will have already looked at the game, they will have scouted the game out, seen what will work in that game, and put it all together before they get there. Very premeditated. Contrary to some people's beliefs, they're usually very strong players on the square. They're usually strong players anyway, without cheating. But they're players who are comfortable to take an edge by doing something outside the rules, and they don't switch off from that. So every interaction and the way they view everything, that is always a thought that's there. This is the important factor. It's much more than things that are happening at the table. Every conversation is framed in that context for the card sharp. Every interaction, they're aware of that context. It's in the forefront of their minds. These are the kind of players that are always concerned about what everybody else is thinking about them, because their cover and the plays that they're employing depend on being under the radar. Sharps like this can work a game for years undetected because they're subtle and very mindful about how they're perceived. There's going to be a lot of players who will have played with a card sharp and they'll never know. They'll go to the grave without knowing. They'll never know that they've been cheated. It's a reality. I remember Daniel Negreanu saying something like, I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the quote in front of me, but he said something like, oh, cheats always get caught because they just get too greedy and they end up getting caught. This to me is illustrative of the point I just made about card sharps going undetected. Daniel Negreanu is drawing from his own vast experience of playing cards, right? I'm not pretending to have anywhere near the experience or ability that a Daniel Negreanu has. But from my standpoint, he's talking about rough cheats. And when he talks about those cheats getting caught because of greed, there's a massive but in that sentence for me, because he's talking about the cheats that he knows about because they got caught. And he's discounting the possibility that he sat down with a card sharp and never had any inkling that there was anything wrong. What we're talking about here with card sharps is an elite cheat who is always thinking about how they're being perceived. That is always at the forefront of their minds. Getting lifted because they've overstretched a play or got greedy, it just doesn't happen when we're talking about this category of cheat. That is a rank mistake. Sharps approach cheating in the same way as a winning player approaches winning, in that they are as academic and studious about that subject as winning players are about studying winning tactics. So now that we've broadly defined the categorizations of cheats, let's start looking at how a card sharp, so forget rough cheats, how a card sharp would view the general categorizations of their opposition. So the regulars, the regular players, the regs as they're usually called, they make up the core of the card room's player base, but they themselves fall into a couple of categories. So weak regs, usually marginal losers, not massive losers. They're there week in, week out, but they're average players at best. There are players that are there who are big losers, who are spewing money week in, week out, but they're in a different category, so we'll get to them in a sec. Then you've got your average reg, your common or garden reg. They're usually break-even-ish players, might be slightly marginally winning. They have winning weeks, they have losing weeks, they're having fun. They're decent players and they enjoy the game. They're there week in, week out. The bread and butter player. Then you've got the strong regs. The regs that are winning a lot. They are consistent winners. Some of them are crushing the games. And they are there week in, week out. And they are taking a good profit out of the games. For a sharp, all these regs, whichever category they fall into, are to be respected. They are to be befriended. The working sharp will always be really careful with how they treat these regs and how they cultivate a relationship with them, because all these regs are there every week. They all know each other, so exposure to any of them is death in that card room or that environment, that game, wherever it may be. The sharp is essentially a reg themselves, and they'll usually come off as an average reg. They won't advertise big wins, so they will try to paint an image that they're an average reg, and they'll be friendly with everyone, even the losing regs. Everybody gets a lot of respect. The strength in being well liked amongst the regs as a sharp is that you might need one of these players to vouch for you at some point. You don't want enemies in the reg base. The other reason why the sharp will always be super careful with how they treat regs and always try to be friends with all of them is because regs can often open doors to other games. Regs will often be the way in to lucrative games via invites oh, I know him, he's a nice person, let's bring him in. That's important networking. Let's move on to the next major category, which is the fish. Let's talk about the most important category, arguably, of player. The players that keep the games going, the fish. There's a lot of names for a fish. Fish, mug, chancer, station, apple, donk, or my personal favourite, bargain. Or you know Martin? And it's like, yeah, I know him, he's a bargain. It just means there's a lot of value in him. There's a long list of names for this category, more than any other category, but they all mean the same thing. Loser. Some players are fish because they're just brand new to the game. They're very green, and they probably won't be fish when they've got enough experience. A lot of fish are just having fun. They're not going to sit at home and study and pore over hand histories and do all those sorts of things to make themselves a good player. They're just having fun. They want to go and they want to play some poker. They usually don't think they're the best player there, and they usually don't think they're the worst. So they're just having fun. Then you've got the best kind of fish, the biggest bargain, which is the fish that thinks that he's solved the game. This is actually one of the most prevalent types of fish. They blame their losses on terrible luck, but they attribute their wins to tremendous skill. These players can have decades of play under their belt without ever improving because of their confidence that they don't need to. The variance in poker, especially holdem, lends itself to being very kind to yourself in these scenarios. Had a winning session? Well, it was down to my flair and brilliance at the table. Had a losing session? Oh, it's just bad luck. Everybody else caught loads of hands. I couldn't catch anything. I remember a reg at one of my local card rooms that was a perfect example of this mindset. And I can actually remember a specific hand I played with her, which cemented my own mental categorization of her as this kind of fish. She min-raised from early position, or it was a weak raise anyway, it was a small raise, and I called with a rag ace in late position. The flop came down with an ace on it. I was really conscious I could be out-kicked here, but she led with like a min bet, it might not have been minimum, but it was a weak bet into this flop, and I just called it, right? I thought I'd float it, I played her before, I knew what she was like. Turn came down, it was a rag, she checked, I checked back. River came down, it was a rag, she checked, and I checked because I thought, right, I'll check because I feel like any bet I make can only be called by a better hand anyway. So I just checked it back. When I showed my rag ace, she rolled her eyes and was like, oh, another bad beat. And she showed pocket jacks. So she played the hand about as badly as she could have played it, letting me in amazingly cheaply, and then playing it really badly post-flop, and called it a bad beat. It was a bog standard beat, but she was rolling her eyes. If she'd bet a reasonable amount pre-flop, I wouldn't even have been in the hand. The whole hand was played so badly from her standpoint, but in her mind, it was a bad beat, and she played great, and I played some stupid hand and got lucky. She was actually there multiple times every week. She'd play cash games, she'd play tournaments. She played constantly, but never improved. And the weird part was, she was actually married to another reg there, and he was quite a good player. He wasn't brilliant, but he was reasonably good. And he obviously never felt the need to educate her in any way, even though sometimes they'd be at the same table, so there's no question in my mind that he knew she was a fish. Maybe he was taking the old don't tap the tank advice to the nth degree, even if it's your own wife. Anyway, these kinds of players are the value. They are why the games keep running. They are why the games are popular. They are why the games can be profitable. So they're super important. And winning players will target fish like that. And so do sharps. but there are some nuances between how a winning player on the square views those players and how the sharp views those players. The sharp will really try to cultivate that relationship. They'll never disagree with that person. They'll laugh at all their jokes. They'll talk about the subjects that that person likes talking about. Talk about their family. Remember their kids' names. They'll try to cultivate that friendship, but they'll also try to make sure that they don't project any image of superiority at the game. They will try to make sure that the fish feels like they're at least at the same level, or even the sharp's not quite as good as them. And that's as much of an art as the poker itself. That finesse is an art in itself. The sharp will hide winning sessions, actively disguise winning sessions if they can from that fish, and they will advertise losses to that fish. They might even seek advice from that fish, because that gives the fish the impression that they are superior at the game in that relationship they've got with the sharp. Because the sharp wants to be the kind of player that that fish wants to play with, and that maybe if they both eliminated from a tournament at one point, they might want to have a heads-up match with. The topic of finessing a relationship like that and how the sharp works that relationship is a topic for another video, and that video will be coming. But for now, let's move on. So, the degenerate players, the degens as they're known for short, they just want to be gambling. They just want to be in action. When they get knocked out of a tourney, they're looking for side action straight away. Anything. Degens aren't always fish though. Some of them are not fish. They're strong players, but they've just got too much gamble in them. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this is the kind of player that the sharp would be all over. But they're often not. They'll be monitored and kept an eye on. But if they're strong, they can still be dangerous. So there might be softer options, unless they're a degen fish, which is our next category. So the degen fish, the most profitable, but also the most pathetic categorization of player. If you've absorbed the information in the last two categories, then you'll already know what I mean by a degen fish, so I won't babble on too much about it. If they find themselves at the table with a couple of strong players, it becomes an unspoken competition of who's going to get their money, who's going to bust them first, basically. Because they're going to get busted by somebody, because it's inevitable. That's our last category. So let's go to some closing thoughts. Players that have been around the game for a while know that you can size up player archetypes in a live context, usually before the game even starts. Just by the way players carry themselves, the conversation, you can almost tell how they're going to play before you sit down. I'd often notice people trying to put up a facade or suggest competency in what they were saying, and that in itself for me was a flag that they were going to be a bargain, really. Even stuff like hearing misused terminology or something that's a bit askew and not how people would normally describe it. Even something as simple as that, but whilst it could just be an innocent mistake, that was often a flag as well. So players who are playing a lot, they're always putting people, I think they're always putting people in boxes and categorizing them. Card sharps are no different, but as we've covered, they do look at certain players as different kinds of propositions than, say, a square, straight up winning player would. I think there's a lot of value for the honest player who's interested in protecting themselves from being cheated, in understanding that dynamic. Like I've mentioned in other videos, if you are targeted, or your game is targeted by a card sharp, and by that I obviously mean a competent cheat, you can forget seeing things like bottom deals and fancy shuffles and things like. You're not going to get any of that back, as I've covered in other videos. You're far better off understanding their approach, how they approach people, how they carry themselves, how they talk to people. Those things are easier to spot and to identify, and therefore raise your consciousness of that person than the really subtle things that might actually happen at the table. If you're noticing nuances that you think, hang on, better keep an eye on this person, then you're more likely to be able to notice other things that don't fit in. And then you can build up maybe a profile where you think, right, okay, I don't really want to play with this person anymore. There's far more value, in my opinion, in understanding that kind of thing than learning what a move looks like at the table, which all the stuff that's been exposed is that you can find anyway on the internet, etc. It's stuff it's tired old tech, basically, that has been exposed for 30 years. It's the old stuff. The new stuff is not out there. The good stuff is not out there. Like I said in the intro, it's better to be able to recognise that the wolf is stalking you rather than understand how he eats you once he's already caught you. Learning about this stuff that we've covered today and the rest of the stuff on this channel will give you the tools to recognise the wolf in this context way before you're expected to notice how big his teeth are. And remember, the wolf in this context is usually Mr. Nice Guy. He's usually the person that everybody gets on with. He's the person that a lot of the players that he plays with week in, week out, his friends, wouldn't hear of him cheating somebody. If he's cultivated his relationships properly and he's finessed the image that he's projecting well, then that's the scenario that he'll be in. The psychology of the cardsharp is something that I haven't seen discussed much anywhere. And I think, therefore, it could be something I could explore on this channel. So there'll be more, hopefully, in this series, touching on other aspects of the psychology of the sharp. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you next time.